Everybody, welcome. My name is Dan Smith. I'm the director of the Africa Initiative and professor of anthropology. I'm glad you're all here today. It's my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Professor Bill Miles from Northeastern University. Bill is a longtime expert in Niger. I'm often fond of saying that political scientists and sociologists and economists are not area experts in the places they work. Some of them anyway. They like to go there and do their research, but don't really invest and embed themselves. That's not true of Bill at all. He's been working in Niger, in northern Nigeria, for his whole career, ever since he was a Peace Corps volunteer way back when he was much younger than he is now. And he's the author of something like 12 books. And he'll tell you, but he was in Niger when the coup happened. And I can't think of a better person to explain Niger's coup in context. So Bill, welcome, and glad to have you here, and we'll proceed from here.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So thanks to all for coming, and I want to begin by saying that I've had a lifelong love affair with Niger, sometimes tumultuous. Dan, I imagine that your relationship with Nigeria might be described in similar terms. And being in Niger during this summer's coup d'etat was certainly one of the most tumultuous times that I've had there as well. My love affair with Niger is intertwined with another lifelong love affair that I've had with this woman sitting to Dan's left, Louisa Nelek Miles, who periodically allows me to return to Niger, including with our children. And when I got stuck there in July on account of the coup, she was instrumental in getting me out. So both going and coming, round trips, thank you, Louisa. So, and if my love affair with Niger and maybe Dan's love affair with Nigeria can be described as tumultuous, mine with Louisa is, Louisa, fill in the blanks. Qu'est-ce que tu dirais? Pour catégoriser notre amour. Okay. Anyway, I assured Dan that my talk would not be about my being in the coup and that whole experience, about my being locked down and then evacuated from there. But then you did say I could devote some of my time talking about it. And I'd like to do so as a springboard for my reflections. Springboard on my reflections on the evolution of Niger during the 40 some odd years that I've been coming back and forth from it. And my basic questions of the reflections that I'm sharing with you are what has fundamentally changed and what has not? What are the constants and what are the variables? So with this audience here at Brown African Studies, I don't really need the bait and switch advisory to say that Niger, sometimes called Niger, should not be confused with Nigeria, nor should it be confused with Niger State in Nigeria. So with that, I'll just begin with March 2021, when Niger elects a president. Mohamed Bazoum, who comes from an ethnic group which is not usually spoken about or represented in Niger. He is from the very tiny minority of Arab speakers, native Arab speakers in the north. And for a lot of people, this was really proof that Niger had evolved considerably from its ethnic politics, where you had, from the colonial period, the French colonial period, one ethnic group, the Zarma, who were both in charge of the military and then the government after independence, up until, say, about 2 decades ago, when they let in the largest ethnic group in Niger into the halls of power. That's the Hausa. That's the group that I know best from both northern Nigeria and Niger. But Bazoum was an Arab, and people would say this represents the new Niger. So I was there in July, and I'll go into the reason I was there in July, but suffice it to say that I was supposed to leave on July 28th. Going to Africa via Royal Air Morocco is a neat experience, Casablanca. But 2 days before, there's a lot of tumult, and the radio, the TV was talking about a coup d'etat. Coup d'etat on the 26th. And a day later, or 2 days later, it was announced that the head of the coup d'etat was General Chiani. And one of the first things he did was to close the land borders of Niger, close the airspace of Niger, and thereby the airport. And one of the first reactions by neighboring states, led by Nigeria, whose president is the head of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, was to say, if you don't let Bazoum out of detention because he was being imprisoned with his family in the presidential palace, cutting off electricity, eventually cutting off water, just living on his own food supplies. And if you don't restore the democratically elected leader and constitutional democracy, we are going to lead an intervention force with the military that ECOWAS cobbles together from time to time. And during those first couple of days after the coup, the French embassy itself was attacked, vandalized. You can see some of what was going on. The US embassy just next door basically was left alone. So there's this animus expressed towards the former French colonial power. That was new to me, to experience that, particularly at that level. And at the same time, you had these signs and flags promoting Russia. This is also completely new, saying, down with France, live Putin, long live Putin. And this shot is taken, I didn't take this picture, but this is a big rally in front of the National Assembly. Nobody knows who called for the rally. And more importantly, I'm asking myself, how did they get Russian flags? You know, you can't buy any flag in Niamey. There's no flag store, okay? And immediately, somehow, you had these big flags all around. And people don't have discretionary income to make fancy banners with slogans printed. This one was a little more artisanal. But I'm still wondering, who were the proxies that the Russians already had there ready to roll this kind of stuff out? So toggling between the general political and the personal, my flight, not surprisingly, was canceled. I was given another flight. I won't go into all of that. As a result of the vandalism, the attack, the French decided to evacuate their citizens. I was living with an American anthropologist who had also been working in Niger for many, many years. And he said, what's going to happen to us? If the American embassy is not being attacked, not under threat, how are we going to get out with flights canceled, at least for a week, and then even then they were postponed? my friend was saying, how are we going to get out? The French are letting the French get out, but Americans are not evacuating. And he says, why don't we try the French? And I said, why would the French let us out? He says, I don't know. And then I said, I wrote a Hail Mary and I said, look, I'm not a French citizen, but I'm married to one. I have 2 children who are French citizens. I actually now have a grandson who's a French citizen. We pay taxes in France. Is that good enough? And since because I've lost some of the time about Niger, I won't go into what happened, except to say that you should always marry wisely. And when you travel, have your marriage documents with you. Because on the basis of our marriage having been transcribed by the French consulate in Boston onto official documents that I could show, I was able to go to the airport, which was at this point filled with French soldiers that had been brought in from France to assist in the evacuation. Stand online with everybody else, and it was somewhat chaotic because they had never trained for this. And eventually I got into the airport and was able to get on to the government aircraft, the République de France, on a flight that was the Air Force run and operated with Air Force and some other services constituting the entire crew. And got as far as Charles de Gaulle in Paris, where, again, I don't know if you could see my going quickly, most of the people on my flight, most of the French citizens, were actually of African descent. Not something that the stereotypical idea of the evacuation of France conjures to mind, but all of us, after being met by the equivalent of the French Red Cross and other crisis evacuation units, asked if we needed a place to stay before we went on for our ongoing travel. So, what was I doing in Niger in the first place? Very first place that Dan made reference to. So there's a surprise quiz test. Okay, we'll see who gets the best score here. Who am I? Who can make me out? Anybody want to? We'll only get 2 tries. 2 people can make a try for an extra cookie. Oh, but every second that goes, I feel older and older. It's the top button.
Oh,
No, the other side.
oh, is this? Oh, I see. Is this you here on the ground?
No, cookie goes to somebody else. And if you don't get it, I get a cookie. Sorry. Oh no.
Keep clicking. Keep clicking. I don't know how you built this. Yeah.
Okay. So I went after graduating from college, not even knowing that Niger existed. And that's where I was as a Peace Corps volunteer for the 2 years that I was living in. Oh, could I have the laser back? In that area by the border with Nigeria, within that square. with another volunteer and a couple of the teachers at the school. I was a middle school teacher of English. That's how I learned to teach, with a little more hair than I have now in front of the classrooms. And now we get to the politics. So when I arrived in 1977, Lieutenant Colonel Seni Kunche had taken power in a coup d'etat 3 years before. And in Peace Corps orientation, even though we were coming from democratic state, First Amendment, we were told, don't talk politics. Okay, that was my first experience with a kind of censorship, but it was okay. And Lieutenant Seni Kunche remained president throughout my 2 years as Peace Corps volunteer and beyond, when I went back to do research along the border between Niger and Nigeria that resulted in this book. And while I was doing research for that book, there was a coup d'etat, not on the Niger side of the border, but the Nigeria side of the border. And President Shehu Shagari, a Hausa in Nigeria, was overthrown by Muhammadu Buhari, also a Hausa, but a Hausa Fulani. I'll get into the nuance if anybody cares. And so I wound up writing an epilogue kind of to the book about the elections in Nigeria, which had gotten Shagari reelected. And at the same time, Kunche was still the president of Niger. Kunche did something very unusual. He died of natural causes. Unusual for an African head of state, particularly one who came to power in a military coup. And he was succeeded by Colonel Ali Saibu after Kunche died in 1987, who reigned until he finally gave up power, and there were elections, and he was succeeded by, can we move this? He was succeeded by himself. Okay, it's the same guy, except one is wearing military tenue, and the other, what they call in Hausa, faranufula, the white hat, the civilian clothing. So eventually, he decided it was time to put Niger back on the path towards democracy. There was a national sovereign conference. Many West African countries were going through that process at the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of countries held these sovereign conferences to say, well, we're no longer in this Cold War trajectory. Authoritarianism, as of a la Soviet Union, is gone. We should go democratic too. And we will have these conferences. So as a result of Niger's National Sovereign Conference, Maman Ousmane was the first Hausa in Niger since independence in 1960 to be head of state until 1996, when there was a coup d'etat and General Ibrahim Mainasara took power. Until he succeeded himself once again. He staged elections, took off his military uniform, and then ran as a, not here a foreign fula, but with a monsieur avec une cravate, so, but a civilian guy. And he remained president until what was called an accident on the tarmac of the airport in Niamey, Niger's capital. He was assassinated by one of his own guards. It's never quite clear what happened, except that he was no longer president. He was succeeded by a one-time lieutenant colonel, Mamadou Tanja, president, as you see those years. And just to let you know that I was going back and forth from Niger, and during this time, I was doing work on what I call de-Africanization, as Niger was becoming more and more Islamic in its culture. Did research on the boundaries of Niger and Nigeria, presented here on here at Watson on West African borders, and some other publications. So he was succeeded just for a little while by another military person until, democracy comes back to Niger with Issoufou Mamadou, okay, until 2021. And in the first transition of one democratically elected president of Niger to another, we had Mohamed Bazoum, whom I showed you at the beginning, who was replaced by General Tiani. So this is my constant number one. What has changed? What has not? What has changed is this pendulum. Back and forth between democratically elected leaders and military coup takers. The very first president of Niger, Hamani Diori, the civilian, he was replaced by Kunche, to whom I introduced you earlier. So I didn't actually, well, maybe I'll get to the slide I want to. Why did Tiani seize power in July? There are reasons that he gave, and there are reasons that are said. And the reason that is said was, what was his position when he took power? He was the head of the presidential guard. In other words, he was there in charge of the military brigade responsible for the security of the president of the country. And he takes power, he deposes the president of Niger. Everybody knew, it was an open rumor, that he was about to be transferred, replaced, demoted from that position. He was going to lose power. And the coup, and the reasons he gave for the coup, very nice and patriotic and security-oriented reasons. But really, at the bottom of it, it was personalistic politics, which my mentor, Professor Bob Charlotte, who has written about Niger since the early 60s, characterizes as personal rule. Personal rule. That's what's going on in Niger, and not only in Niger. So, African Politics 101, take care of your military. Make sure that the people who are protecting you and the army in general is happy. And Bazoum did not do that sufficiently. He antagonized Tiani. Tiani takes over, and this politics and military, something written about for some time in the context of Niger and in other West African countries. So if the pendulum is the constant number one that I want to emphasize, the second is the extreme poverty in which the Nigerian people live and have been living since before independence, certainly from independence, and documented by the United Nations Development Program since they initiated in 1990 the Human Development Index. 1990, the HDI, which ranks every country in the world by their level of human development. It's not just GNP per capita, which is part of it. But it's also life expectancy. It's also educational opportunities and actual education. So in the very first year that this was made, Niger was the least developed country in the world. More recently, you can see some of the stats here that situate Niger not only in reference to the world at large, but sub-Saharan Africa in particular, which I think is a better margin of for comparison. So why do I say that Niger is still the world's, I mean, this is a terrible competition to be in, who ranks last in human development. Actually, South Sudan does right now. But remember, South Sudan has only been independent for a decade or so. So it's not a fair comparison. And if you can, I've counted for you all of the human development indexes from 1990 until now. And Niger has been at the bottom for more years than any other country. And this is what poverty looks like in Niger, where in order to cook, women have to go out and still collect firewood. Old women. For women to cook, they have to get up before sunrise and pound in these giant mortars and pestles the grain that they and their husbands and children would have collected if it was a successful harvest season. And Niger relies on rain-fed agriculture, which means when the climate is screwed up, as it is now, and the rains are not predictable, as they are not now, then you can have hunger, famine, and starvation. Even today, blind people in the public square begging. There's no Medicaid, Medicare in the Nigerian system for blind people. And they live by coming to your home and chanting, this is in Niger or in northern Nigeria, Islamic songs and prayers for alms. These are all my shots, the ones that I've just shown you. A beggar outside of my Peace Corps home in that case. People with dermatological conditions, people who can't even be institutionalized for mental health problems because they don't have mental health facilities in Niger.
You engage any deaf people?
Deaf, yes, yeah. When I did a census in the villages where I did my anthropological work, borrowing from the colonial authorities, the British on the Nigerian side, there would be a category for deaf people, as well as blind people, as well as lepers, as this woman is, as well as mentally unstable people. And yes, actually, because you asked that, I brought to Niger in 2006 students from Northeastern, and I had there with us an American hearing impaired student. And in the village, we connected him to deaf people in the village where I did my research.
So there's sign language there.
So well, that's where I learned that there are different languages have different sign languages.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just curious.
So it was a challenge, and I added that to a research agenda that I was doing. So what's happening to this baby? Looks a little cruel, if not a little unusual, if not cruel. All they're doing is weighing him. They're weighing him to see if he is malnourished. The reason I have this image is to remind me, when I was in the village this summer, I was thanked again prolifically for giving somebody what I was thanked for in the early 80s for giving them. Not a bottle of drinking water, an empty bottle. Because they don't even have containers that they can fill up with water to go out into the fields and have something to drink. So even disposable containers is at a premium there. I mean, that's the level of poverty that we're talking about. Corruption. So I mentioned the famine and starvation. The reason that Seni Kunche, the first military ruler of Niger, came to power is because during a famine in the early mid-1970s throughout West Africa, food aid sent mostly from the United States but elsewhere was being siphoned off by the elite and members of the civilian government. And that became known, and that's why Kunche took power to deal with the corruption that was literally killing by starvation his own people. I saw him as a benevolent dictator when I was there. But over time, even dictators, even military dictators, succumb to the lure of corruption. And using Transparency International, we can track Niger's dire trajectory in terms of corruption. So what I call cultural constant. So I told you about the pendulum for the political, talked about the economic for poverty. One affirming constant is what I call resilience through faith. The fact that Nigerians remain incredibly hospitable, incredibly generous with the little that they have, just floors me. The anthropologist I was living with this summer, Scott Youngstead of Saginaw State University in Michigan, he authored the book Surviving with Dignity, whose title really encapsulates what I'm talking about. And on the left, the Niger that I know, that's what I wrote. So what are some of the other major changes? Okay. In terms of demography, the most preoccupying statistic is the birth rate. So whatever number you have in your head, what is the birth rate per 1,000 in the US? Anybody want to just take a wild guess?
2.1.
2.1. Okay, what about the world average? Go ahead. 3.5. So Niger, off the charts in terms of world population. And most of the population lives in this tiny band, about a quarter of Niger's land surface. So when I started in Niger, there were about 6 million people living in the entire country. Now it's quadruple. But they're not expanding into the Sahara Desert. It's more and more. Technology. This is a major change. And it's the reason that I'm invoking Dan's recent book. One of the chapters has to do with communication technology. and the way that cell phone and the cell phone industry has really shaped the cultural interaction is a major and probably the major technological change that I've witnessed in Niger over the years. I'd say more about the book, which is a great book and relevant in certain ways to Niger, such as the communications one. Security. Now, this could be a presentation in and of itself. One of the major pretexts for the coup in Niger this summer was that the government was not dealing successfully with terrorism, violent extremism that has really been an issue in the far western and the far eastern part of Niger. Boko Haram, notoriously known for having kidnapped the schoolgirls in Nigeria, under pressure from Chad, Cameroon, and Nigeria, has moved into Niger and has done operations. Al-Qaeda and ISIS offshoots in the Islamic Maghreb, and particularly in this area where Mali, Burkina, and Niger come together, called Liptako, has been a bane. And the General Chiani blames Bazoum for not getting this under control. And it has been the French and the Americans who've been helping most in tamping down, in confronting terrorist groups in Niger. And the French thrown out, as you saw the attack on the embassy, and we'll see what happens with the US next. Another major change is what I call theopolitics. I mentioned this briefly. Over time, Islam has become so prominent in the public sphere. It's not just a private faith choice. Legislating in Nigeria, but also this kind of influence in Niger, the fact that Sharia law, Islamic law, is the law of the state, not the whole state, but the individual states in which it has been adopted. So take a look at these girls whose pictures I took when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. De-Africanization means that today they're going to dress with a hijab, even really young girls, much less women. And the other major change is border life. And this gets into really why I was there in July. This is the border pole separating my Nigerian friend on the right in Nigeria from the Nigerian on the left. A literal, not a line in the sand, but a pole in the sand. Fast forward, this is what exists now at that same exact point. An immigration station put up on the Nigerian side of the border. This is a post 9/11 phenomenon. So what was I doing in Niger this time in July? Quite simply, I was doing research at the National Boundary Commission of Niger, at the this is the same thing, just the former location, the bilateral Commission of Cooperation between Niger and Nigeria. And a week before the coup, I was actually able to, even though foreigners were not allowed without a military escort to leave the capital, I was able to go back to the region where I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer, where I did my research for the book in these village in Niger, this village in Nigeria, and was there for two missions of the National Boundary Commission with borderland people. This is, Louisa, you haven't seen, this is what our home in Niger looks like now. And this was this was at the meeting of the Boundary Commission in one of those Nigerian border villages. So to conclude, where are we now in Niger? France has, under pressure from the military of the junta, taken out its troops. This was after weeks and weeks of protests by civilians at the edge of the French military base in Niamey. After months of saying that we, the United States, do not recognize the coup makers of Niger as the leaders of Niger, we have finally backed down, and we've declared it a coup, which means that $500 million, I believe, of aid that we had been giving for both humanitarian and military counterterrorism assistance is gone. That's because of US legislation. Just last week, I was lucky to have a former general from Nigeria come speak to my class in Niger, at Northeastern. He was also General Dambazu, former Minister of the Interior. So he was responsible for the boundaries of Nigeria that I have crossed so many times. And he was there to explain why is it that Nigeria has taken the lead in pressuring Niger to release Bazoum and to restore democracy, and why have they backed down and are no longer threatening military intervention. And I think this is my penultimate slide. This is a constant. The way that Nigerians view themselves from a cultural sense. And even though the original proverb refers to the house of people, I think we can say that in general, Nigerians remain committed to their fellow brothers and sisters as Nigerian, but they can't do what they would like to do because of the poverty. So, so apologies for the typo, an acknowledgement to one man in particular for the research that I recently conducted. Why in the world? Yes, huh? This is not a glitch, Alex. This is not our tech. It's because Benjamin Franklin was the founder of the American Philosophical Society. And they give grants even to oddball political scientists like me to do the kind of research that I have been doing in Niger. And I want to thank Benjamin, wherever you are, and the APS, the American Philosophical Society, for funding my trip to Niger this summer. And I should acknowledge, of course, the government of France for evacuating me when before the US government announced that it would do the same for American citizens. So with apologies for the technical glitches, I thank you for your attention.
Well, before I go to question, you have to build your own questions, Bill. People put their hands up and call in.
You can do it that way.
What would have happened if you had to stay?
Well, I'd have to somehow explain to my wife why I had chosen to go to a place which on the State Department website had already said use due caution or reconsider travel. going to Niger. But it had been that way for over a year.
Would you have been in danger if your life?
No, well, no, I'm glad you asked that. I don't think that my life would have been in danger, except for my wife, for putting myself in this situation. And this is, well, we're being recorded. So I can't say what I'm going to say, but I otherwise would have said. I don't feel that I was personally in danger. Partially because, in large part, because I do speak the major lingua franca of Niger, because I do speak Hausa, and I can easily reassure people that I'm not French, because hardly any French people there have learned any of the 7 African languages that are spoken in Niger. Eventually, the US did have an evacuation of its citizens. So eventually, I would have gotten out, as my colleague did, on an American evacuation, but I'm told that unlike the French, they're going to bill the evacuees. Yes?
Yes, I mean, my research, I work in the Middle East, I'm a graduate student here from, and I was spending some time, earlier this spring, and I was told by Brown University, oh, if you go to this place, and you're doing it on Brown's time, like, because the State Department is changing its policy, it's required, if evacuation is required, like, you have to pay for that out of pocket.
Well, that's the confirmation. France didn't even ask for my address.
But there would have been planes, American planes.
I think there was only one. The French had 2 days of multiple flights coming from Paris in rotation. And I was on day 2. That's a whole other story, how I actually was able to figure out that I was eligible and convince people at an otherwise very chaotic airport that I was eligible.
I do have a question. Well, I have 2 questions. So the first one is about, I'm wondering if the, if there are any democratic efforts to help create a constitution or some kind of legislative arm in Niger that can help keep a balance on the pendulum that you were talking about.
Yes.
And then the second thing, I just wanted you to comment on the surveillance attitude towards the French government, because this coup sort of started, as you mentioned, like probably or it's coming from a personal demotion of power point of view, but then it escalates into civilians tearing down the French embassy. So if you could comment a little bit about that, and where the sympathy for Russia and Putin might be coming from at the same time.
Can I answer in the reverse order? So, although I haven't evidence, but I alluded to this, there must be proxies who are being paid in Niger. And it's not out of ideology. It's out of poverty. And this holds for those tiny fraction of Nigerian men who do decide to join Al-Qaeda or ISIS in the Islamic Maghreb. They've got no prospects, they've got no employment, they've got no hope. So in those circumstances, money can get people to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. And I'm sure that somehow, whether it's Wagner or some other intermediaries, they're getting money into Niger so that, like on a dime, you could get these pro-Russian posters. I didn't show the biggest ones. and Russian flags, and getting people to these demonstrations in favor of Russia. You know, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer and I got very sick, this was during the Cold War, and I was in Niger, and I was told to go to the public hospital. And the only doctor who was there was Soviet, Russian, the Cold War, you know. Am I going to, is he going to take care of me or is he going to take care of me? So, you know, I think back then to now, where there's no Soviet Union, but the Russia of Putin resembles more the Russia within the Soviet Union of the 1970s than it did in the early 2000s. And the sentiment is, I don't think it's real, genuine, and deep. I think it's bought. I think it's purchased. In terms of attitudes towards France, now that's very interesting because France is particularly criticized for dominating, monopolizing the uranium extraction industry, which is true. Uranium in Niger is one of the major money makers, and it has been under a French commercial enterprise since it was discovered in the 60s. And is the wealth distributed? Well, the wealth that the Nigerian government gets from the uranium exports of the French government are distributed not by the French, but by the Nigerian government. But it's easy to blame the French for exploiting France, particularly because of its mineral extraction, when Nigerians are going hungry. And France is one of the major donors of humanitarian aid to Niger as well. But that hasn't, quote unquote, bought them the popularity that they would have wanted. I think that the coup leaders knew that two buttons to press are the terrorism button and the neocolonialism button. Patriotism. We're going to be Nigerian patriots out with the French. And to a large extent, to me, that's a cover for the personalistic politics that really drove this particular coup against Bazoum, President Bazoum. Your first question, so Niger does have a parliament. It does have elected leaders. It does have multi-party democracy. That was dissolved by the coup. Their system is based on the French. You know, for all the anti-French rhetoric that has come out of Niger following the coup, let's not forget that all of their institutions are really based on the French system, including the education system. That unlike other African countries, they have not promoted local languages as languages of instruction and literacy. They've kept French. And so institutionally, culturally, the France remains. So I think the anti-French rhetoric really is, again, instrumental. And all of this is really focused in the capital. All the politics that I discussed, or most of it at the first part of my presentation, this is Niamey politics. In other words, the capital. And out in the village, where I'm not a stranger, I feel a stranger in the capital. That's not the Niger that I know. I wouldn't even go through Niger and through Niamey to go to my village in the intervening years. I would go to Nigeria. But that became problematic for another detention story that I have in 2019. So it's not that the institutions don't exist, it's that the power of the gun and the uniform is such that you can easily overwhelm whatever democratic cultural values have been over time being inculcated.
Yeah, I remember earlier we were talking about being evacuated, that you said most of the people on the plane were actually of African descent.
Yes.
Is that because, you know, French, I guess, citizenship is sort of common in the area? Is that like, is there sort of a class distinction there, or are there, you know, I guess African people from like other Francophone countries who are in Niger, or, you know, I was just sort of wondering like what the reasoning might be for that, or if that was like an abnormal thing, or, you know, or that's.
So, are you a student?
Yes, I'm a grad student here.
Grad student, that's what I was guessing. Do you already have a thesis topic in mind for? Because this is actually something that came in my mind when I was on the plane and online. You know, what is the background of all of these French citizens? All right, and other European citizens, because they let other EU citizens on. Where are they from, and what are their connections with Niger? Are they dependents? Are these mixed marriages, French and Nigerian? Are these people usually based in France, who were there for their summer vacation, visiting family in the homeland? Are these people based in Niger, who happen to have French citizenship through family? How many of them are of direct African descent with French citizenship, and si tu me permets, and how many of them, like my wife, have West Indian ethnicity, partially from Africa, but as a result of being part of France, even today. I'm talking about Martinique, Guadeloupe, and other French overseas territories have wound up in Niger for any number of personal, business, or family ties.
They were from the colonial army before
and stay. Right. So, not to get too personal, but my late father-in-law, Louise's father, born in Martinique, which is populated mostly by descendants of African slaves. During the late colonial era, in the 1950s, he was part of the French colonial army, because what the French liked to do in their so-called new colonies, like in Africa, was to take people from the old colonies, in this case Martinique, because they sort of looked like the people in the new colonies in Africa, and use them as intermediary administrators. So, how many of them stayed on? How many of them stayed in contact? But certainly, some of them, some of the people on the plane very well may have that West Indian, French, and African connection. But you see all the different directions that research into this could lead one. So let's stay in contact if you like the idea.
for your talk today. In your talk, you contextualized the most recent coup in Niger in terms of Niger's history. But the coup in Niger is not the only coup that has happened recently in West Africa.
Right.
There have also been coups in Burkina Faso and Guinea.
Guinea, Mali,
Too.
right, yeah.
Mali. And so I was wondering if you could zoom out a little bit to this bigger regional context and offer some thoughts and reflections as to what are maybe the bigger regional dynamics that have driven this sort of recent series of coup d'etats.
Right. So I'm glad you asked the question. So I've done research. In fact, I've actually done some consulting for AID in Mali. I've done it in Chad on the other side, and also in Burkina for AID. And because I mentioned Chad, I want you to know that after the coup leaders in Mali threw out the French soldiers, they went to Niger. Now that they're thrown out of Niger, they're going to Chad. Same thing with Burkina. I think well, I don't know exactly how many soldiers, if there was a real contingent of French soldiers in Burkina Faso. But Chad has become the last of the, and it's not even really West Africa, Central Africa, the last bastion of a French counterterrorism effort in West Africa. And everyone thought that Niger was the last bastion, but now they're extending the notion of West Africa to include Chad. So the dynamics are, and this goes back to looking at cleavages that can be exploited on the Russian side, and particularly in this global context of the war with Ukraine, purchasing allies at the United Nations for votes. I definitely this plays a part of it, because as the French leave, that creates a vacuum. Who's going to fill the vacuum? And the Russian presence is known in Mali. It's much more advanced in Mali than in Burkina or in Niger. But I think this is part of the overall dynamic. The other overall dynamic is, with the partial exception of Guinea, these countries remain literally dirt poor, mostly in the Sahel, or in the case of Niger, mostly in the Sahara Desert. Very difficult place to have productive agriculture. Again, rain-fed agriculture, climate change making things worse, disrupting patterns, accelerating migration of particularly young men, those who would be working the fields during the rainy season, the harvest, which are not happening the way that they potentially have been. So I'm sure do you have another dynamic in mind that you wanted to add to the mix?
In terms of West Africa.
The dimension, yeah, in terms of West Africa.
No, I don't feel like I know West Africa.
Right.
The politics sort of
Right, but overall, I think it's the globalization of even local Nigerian or domestic Nigerian politics to a wider scheme in which where do we fit in? And I go back to what I mentioned when I was referencing Dan's book, and I get this every day because I get WhatsApp messages from Nigeria, actually, not so much from Niger, where they're exposed to some of the worst of disinformation, misinformation on social media. That no context to discriminate what is accurate from what is made up. And I think this is perverting, and it's not a word I use often, the consciousness of untold numbers of newly connected West Africans who are the target of disinformation, propaganda, and who are more open to different narratives of who's the villain and who's the good guy, and really vulnerable to that. That makes these kinds of things possible.
So much for your presentation. Two questions. The first is, I wonder if you could go back with us a little bit on politics around taking photos of people who are living, as you mentioned, the currently the presentation of living in the worst kinds of policies. I asked this question from the perspective of anthropologists, and we're having all kinds of debates in our discipline and have had. There's debates about what it means for researchers to produce. And the second is, I wonder if you could look at this a little bit about the nuances that populate the textures of Islam, not just in India, but in the region. I haven't read much about Niger. I know most of what I know comes from East Africa, primarily the Swahili coast. And I know that there are strains of animist interpretations of Islam. There's certainly Niger, there's Salafi. And so rather than, thinking of Islam as just one monolith, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on just this, the different traditions of Islam that exist.
Okay, so again, I'm going to answer in reverse order if I can. So in the case of Niger and Islam, we cannot separate it from Nigeria and Islam. And in the 1980s, there was a movement called Izala in northern Nigeria, which sees itself as a purifying version, a fundamentalist version of Islam. And what they took target at was what anthropologists would call syncretic version of Islam that wedded together African customs and African culture, indigenous African culture, to the Islamic religion. And Izala said, no, we have to get rid of all of that. And that article that I made reference to in terms of de-Africanization is exactly this, that Izala has spread to a certain extent from northern Nigeria into Niger. Remember, it's the same Hausa ethnic group, which is the locus of this movement, and who would say, for instance, that women must cover their hair, and women of all ages, all girls, and that Islam must be part of the political system. So this is happening in Niger over the last couple of decades, as it has in Nigeria. Not to the same extent, and paradoxically, because of the French, they call laïcité, the French notion of separation of church and state, which Niger has adopted in its system, even though it's not 95% Muslim. So that's the short answer, and I can say more about Islam in Niger, which is still to a very large extent syncretic. The more you go out into the rural areas, but can be politicized through the Izala way. the question about photography and the politics and the ethics of taking. So remember I said there were two things that our Peace Corps trainers told us. Don't talk politics when you're under a coup d'etat. And secondly, don't take pictures of people without their permission. And so in the town where I lived as a volunteer for 2 years, and then in the villages, which I lived in for initially 1 year and then coming back and forth, in Niger-Nigeria across the border. I mean, I know the people, they're friends. People would ask me to take their pictures. That's a different thing than, say, in the capital or in any urban environment where you don't know people. And yeah, you do have to be very sensitive, and you do have to ask, and you can get into trouble by taking pictures of people, or taking pictures not of people, but being seen to take pictures and bystanders thinking that you're taking pictures of people. For instance, one thing that I do, I'd like to take pictures of signboards of buildings, but people don't see what's in my viewfinder. And this time I was taken on this trip, taken to task by a woman and a little an open stand on this road shop for taking a picture of people. That's in the capital. They used to say that Muslims or / Africans believe that you're stealing the soul by taking an image, by taking a picture, meaning taking an image, taking their soul. I haven't heard that explanation or trope in a very long time. But it is very sensitive. It is very sensitive. And it's all a question of, do you know the person or not? In terms of technology, now, for the first time, because everyone's got a cell phone, even in these villages, they're taking pictures of me. They're not even asking. And I don't know what they're doing with the pictures, but I mean, there's a lot to be said about photography in the ethnographic situation, and you really do have to be sensitive to it, and it's very culturally contextual. So that, and I have to put in a plug for our daughter, okay, who did her Peace Corps service in East Africa, and where Islam, yes, is quite different. Is particularly when it's the syncretic form that incorporates larger Swahili culture than in West Africa.
So we're just about out of time. Does anybody have a last question before we thank Bill?
What was the main goal of the Peace Corps, and how long was it? Was it in Niger? And how long were you there?
Right. So Peace Corps in Niger ended, I think, 2 years or a year after I brought students from my university, Northeastern, there on a study tour. And the reason is because of the security situation. That was the first major terrorist event in which they Islamists kidnapped a French volunteer, and in the attempt to rescue him, he was killed. The French was trying. So that's when Peace Corps ended in 2007 or 2008 in Niger. I was there, I guess 30 years before that. I started in 1977 for those 2 years. And the mission of Peace Corps is the same as it always is. It's been threefold. One is to assist people in developing nations. The second mission is to learn about the cultures of these other the places where people serve. And the third is to, and this is what I'm doing now, imparting what we have learned by living overseas to an American public who otherwise wouldn't know anything about Niger. And I'll just repeat something that I said earlier. When I was graduating from college and applying to the Peace Corps, I didn't even know that this country existed. That's how ignorant I was. And so those three missions of the Peace Corps, and the most important of the three, by far, it's not the assistance that a college graduate really can do in this foreign culture, foreign environment. It's really the way that we learn about the world. We as Americans learn about the world in ways that we otherwise wouldn't, and then share that knowledge.
Were there specific projects you were working on there?
Yeah, I was teaching English. And as a result of teaching English as a foreign language, so I was teaching English in a school system where the language of instruction was French, but French was the second, if not third language of all my students. First language was Hausa for most of them. For the nomadic kids in the area, their first language was Fulfulde or Fulani, but they also had to learn Hausa because that was the lingua franca of the region. Then they'd go to school to learn French. And then here walks in an American who says that English is important. And if I may, for decades and decades, I was wondering, did it make a difference? You know, what good was teaching English in this remote, rural town could it be? I mean, what sense of it? And then about 5 years ago, I was sitting in my office and I got a phone call from somebody who is asking me if I was the same, and he used the local name I was known for, who taught in that village, in that town. Actually, it was a town for Peace Corps. And I said I was. And he said, well, I was your student. And I remembered him because he was the smallest kid in the class and the smartest by far in that English class. And he was calling me from his office in the World Bank. He has become a staffer for the World Bank internationally. And without English, that would not have happened. So it took me, decades to realize that just as the Hausa planters in the rainy season will put seeds, here and there, and they won't know for months whether it will come up or not. That's how I started to view my Peace Corps activities. I planted seeds in that schoolroom, and it took decades for me to know that at least one of those seeds really sprouted. And I just hope that there are other ones there too.
Okay. Let's thank Bill for joining us.